So this is a first video for the elder statesman, and the purpose of this video is to read something from an elder statesman. So it may either be informative or actually just calming, and you may just fall asleep. So Winston Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 1, is out of copyright 1911 to 1914. Chapter 1, The Vials of Wrath, 1870 to 1904. To put on record what were the grounds of feud. The unending task, ruthless war, the Victorian age, national pride, national accountability, the Franco-German feud, Bismarck's apprehension, his precautions and alliances, the Bismarckian period and system, the young emperor and Caprivi, the Franco-Russian alliance 1892, the balance of power, Anglo-German ties, Anglo-German estrangement, Germany and the South African War, the beginnings of the German Navy, the birth of a challenge, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the Russo-Japanese War, consequences, the Anglo-French agreement of 1904, Lord Rosebery's comment, the Triple Entente, degeneration in Turkey and Austria, the long descent, the sinister hypothesis. It was the custom in the palmy days of Queen Victoria for statesmen to expatiate upon the glories of the British Empire and to rejoice in that protecting providence which had preserved us through so many dangers and brought us at length into a secure and prosperous age. Little did they know that the worst perils had still to be encountered and the greatest triumph were yet to be won. Children were taught of the Great War against Napoleon as the culminating effort in the history of the British peoples, and they looked on Waterloo and Trafalgar as the supreme achievement of British arms by land and sea. These prodigious victories, eclipsing all that had gone before, seemed the fit and predestined ending to the long drama of our island race, which had advanced over 1,000 years from small and weak beginnings to a foremost position in the world. 3 separate times in 3 different centuries had the British people rescued Europe from a military domination. Thrice had the Low Countries been assailed by Spain, by the French monarchy, by the French Empire. Thrice had British war and policy often maintained single-handed overthrown the aggressor. Always at the outset, the strength of the enemy had seemed overwhelming. Always the struggle had been prolonged through many years and awful hazards. Always the victory had last been won. And the last of all the victories had been the greatest of all, gained after the most ruinous struggle and over the most formidable foe. Surely that was the end of the tale, as it was so often the end of the book. History showed the rise, culmination, splendour, transition and decline of states and empires. It seemed inconceivable that the same series of tremendous events, though which since the days of Queen Elizabeth we had 3 times made our way successfully, should be repeated a 4th time and on immeasurably large scale. Yet that is what happened, and we have lived to see. The Great War through which we have passed differed from all ancient wars in the immense power of the combatants and the fearful agencies of destruction, and from all modern wars in the utter ruthlessness with which it was fought. All the horrors of all the ages were brought together, and not only armies but whole populations were thrust into the midst of them. The mighty educated states involved conceived with reason that their very existence was at stake. Germany, having let hell loose, kept well in the van of the terror, but she was followed step by the desperate and untimely avenging nations she had assailed. Every outrage against humanity or international law was repaid by reprisals, often on a greater scale and on longer duration. No truce or parley mitigated the strife of the armies. The wounded died between the lines, the dead mouldered into the soil. Merchant ships and neutral ships and hospital ships were sunk on the seas, and all on board left to their fate, or killed as they swam. Every effort was made to starve whole nations into submission, without regard to age or sex. Cities and monuments were smashed by artillery. Bombs from the air were cast down indiscriminately. Poison gas in many forms stifled or seared the soldiers. Liquid fire was projected upon their bodies. Men fell from the air in flames or were smothered, often slowly in the dark recesses of the sea. The fighting strength of armies was limited only by the manhood of their countries. Europe and large parts of Asia and Africa became one vast battlefield on which, after years of struggle, not armies but nations broke and ran. When all was over, torture and cannibalism were the only two expedients that the civilized, scientific Christian states had been able to deny themselves, and these were of doubtful utility. But nothing daunted the valiant heart of man. Son of the Stone Age, vanquisher of nature with all her trials and monsters, he met the awful and self-inflicted agony with new reserves of fortitude. Freed in the main by his intelligence from medieval fears, he marched to death with sombre dignity. His nervous system was found in the 20th century capable of enduring physical and moral stresses before which the simpler natures of primeval times would have collapsed. Again and again to the hideous bombardment, again and again from the hospital to the front, again and again to the hungry submarines he strode unflinching. And withal, as an individual, preserved through these torments the glories of a reasonable and compassionate mind. In the beginning of the 20th century, men were everywhere unconscious of the rate at which the world was growing. It required the convulsion of the war to awaken the nations to the knowledge of their strength. For a year after the war had begun, hardly anyone understood how terrific, how almost inexhaustible were the resources in force, in substance, in virtue, behind every one of the combatants. The vials of wrath were full, but so were the reservoirs of power. From the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and still more after 1870, the accumulation of wealth and health by every civilized community had been practically unchecked. Here and there a retarding episode had occurred. The waves had recoiled after advancing, but the mountain tide still flowed. And when the dread signal of Armageddon was made, mankind was found to be many times stronger in valour, in endurance, in brains, in science, in apparatus, in organisation, not only than it had ever been before, but than even in its most audacious optimists had dared to dream. The Victorian age was the age of accumulation, not of a mere piling up of material wealth, but the growth and gathering in every land of all those elements and factors which go to make up the power of states. Education spread itself over the broad surface of the millions. Science had opened the limitless treasure house of nature. Door after door had been unlocked. One dim, mysterious gallery after another had been lighted up, explored, made free for all, and every gallery entered gave access to at least two more. Every morning when the world woke up, some new machinery had started running. Every night while the world had supper, it was running still. It ran on while all men slept. And the advance of the collected mind was at a similar pace. Disraeli said of the early years of the 19th century, in those days England was for the few and for the very few. Every year of Queen Victoria's reign saw those limits broken and extended. Every year brought in new thousands of people in private stations who thought about their own country and its story and its duties towards other countries, to the world and to the future, and understood the greatness of the responsibilities of which they were the heirs. Every year diffused a wider measure of material comfort among the high ranks of labour. Substantial progress was made in mitigating the hard lot of the mass. Their health improved, their lives and the lives of their children were brightened. Their stature grew, their securities against some of their gravest misfortunes were multiplied, their numbers greatly increased. Thus, when the trumpet sounded, every class and rank had something to give to the needs of the state. Some gave their science, and some their wealth. Some gave their business energy and drive, some their wonderful personal prowess, and some their patent strength or patient weakness. But none gave more or gave more readily than the common man or woman who had nothing but a precious week's wages between them and poverty, and owned little more than the slender equipment of a cottage and the garments in which they stood upright. Their love and pride of country, their loyalty to the symbols with which they were familiar, their keen sense of right and wrong as they saw it, led them to outface and endure perils and ordeals the like of which men had not known on earth. But these developments, these virtues, were no monopoly of any one nation. In every free country, great or small, the spirit of patriotism and nationality grew steady, and in every country, bond or free, the organisation and structure into which men were fitted by the laws gathered and armed this sentiment. For more than their vices, the virtues of nations, ill-directed or misdirected by their rulers, became the cause of their own undoing and of the general catastrophe. And these rulers in Germany, Austria and Italy, in France, Russia or Britain, how far were they to blame? Was there any man of any real eminence and responsibility whose devil heart conceived and willed this awful thing? One rises from the study of the causes of the Great War with a prevailing sense of defective control of individuals upon world fortunes. It has been well said, and there is always more error than design in human affairs. The limited minds, even of the ablest men, their disputed authority, the climate of opinion in which they dwell, their transient and partial contributions to the mighty problem That problem itself so far beyond their compass, so vast in scale and detail, so changing in its aspect, all this must surely be considered before. That problem itself so far beyond their compass, so vast in scale and detail, so changing in its aspect, all this must surely be considered before the complete condemnation of the vanquished or the complete acquittal of the victors can be pronounced. Events also got onto certain lines and no one could get them off again. Germany clanked obstinately, recklessly, awkwardly towards the crater and dragged us all in with her. But fierce resentment dwelt in France, and in Russia there were wheels within wheels. Could we in England, perhaps by some effort, by some sacrifice of our material interests, by some compulsive gesture at once of friendship and command, have reconciled France and Germany in time and forearmed that grand association on which alone the peace and glory of Europe would be safe? I cannot tell. I only know that we tried our best to steer our country through the gathering dangers of the armed peace without bringing her to war or others to war. And when these efforts failed, we drove through the tempest without bringing her to destruction. There is no need here to trace the ancient causes of quarrel between the Germans and the French, to catalogue the conflicts with which they have scarred the centuries, nor to appraise the balance of inquiry or of provocation on one side or the other. When on the 18th of January 1871 the triumph of the Germans was consolidated by the proclamation of the German Empire in the Palace of Versailles, a new volume of European history was opened. Europe, it was said, has lost a mistress and gained a master. A new and mighty state had come into being, sustained by the overflowing population, equipped with science and learning, organised for war and crowned with victory. France, stripped of Alsace and Lorraine, beaten, impoverished, divided and alone, condemned to a decisive and increasing numerical inferiority, fell back to ponder in shade and isolation on her departed glories. But the chiefs of the German Empire were under no illusions as to the formidable character and implacable resolve of their prostate antagonist. What we have gained by arms in half a year, said Moltke, we must protect by arms for half a century, if it is not to be torn from us again. Bismarck, more prudent still, would never have taken Lorraine, forced by military pressure to assume the double burden against his better judgment. He exhibited from the outset and in every act of his policy an extreme apprehension. Restrained by the opinion of the world and the decided attitude of Great Britain, from striking down a reviving France in 1875, he devoted his whole power and genius to the construction of an elaborate system of alliances designed to secure the continued ascendancy of Germany and the maintenance of her conquests. He knew the quarrel with France was irreconcilable except at a price which Germany would never consent to pay. He understood that the abiding enmity of a terrific people would be fixed on his new-built empire. Everything else must be subordinated to the central fact. Germany could afford no other antagonisms. In 1879 he formed an alliance with Austria. 4 years later, this was expanded into the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria and Italy. Romania was brought into the system by a secret alliance in 1883. Not only must there be insurance, there must be reinsurance. What he feared most was a counter-alliance between France and Russia, and none of these extending arrangements met his danger. His alliance with Austria, indeed, if left by itself, would naturally tend to draw France and Russia together. Could he not make a league of the three emperors, Germany, Austria and Russia united? There at last was overwhelming strength and enduring safety. When in 1887, after 6 years, the supreme ideal of Bismarck was ruptured by the clash of Russian and Austrian interests in the Balkans. He turned, as the best means still open to him, to his reinsurance treaty with Russia. Germany, by this arrangement, secured herself against becoming the object of an aggressive combination by France and Russia. Russia, on the other hand, was reassured that the Austro-German alliance would not be used to undermine her position in the Balkans. All these cautious and sapient measures were designed with the object of enabling Germany to enjoy her victory in peace. The Bismarckian system further always included the principle of good relations with Great Britain. This was necessary, for it is well known that Italy would never willingly commit herself to anything that would bring her into war with Great Britain, and had, as the world knows now, required this fact to be specifically stated in the original and secret text of the Triple Alliance. To this alliance, in its early years, Great Britain had been wholly favourable. Thus France was left to nurse her scars alone, and Germany, assured in her predominance on the continent, was able to take the fullest advantage of the immense industrial developments which characterised the close of the 19th century. The policy of Germany further encouraged France as a consolation to develop her colonial possessions in order to take her thoughts off Europe, and incidentally to promote a convenient rivalry and friction with Great Britain. This arrangement, under which Europe lived rigidly but peacefully for 20 years and Germany waxed in power and splendour, was ended in 1890 with the fall of Bismarck. The Iron Chancellor was gone, and new forces began to assail the system he had maintained with consummate ability so long. There was a constant danger of conflagration in the Balkans and in the Near East through Turkish misgovernment. The rising tides of pan-Slavism and the strong anti-German currents in Russia began to wash against the structure of the Renaissance Treaty. Lastly, German ambitions grew with German prosperity. Not content with the hegemony of Europe, she sought a colonial dominion. Already the great military empires, she began increasingly to turn her thoughts to the sea. The young emperor, freed from Bismarck and finding in Count Caprivi and the lesser men who succeeded him complacent coadjutors, began gaily to despise with the safeguards and precautions by which the safety of Germany had been buttressed. While the quarrel with France remained open and undying, the reinsurance treaty with Russia was dropped, and later on the naval rivalry with Britain it was begun. These two sombre decisions rolled forward slowly as the years unfolded. Their consequences became apparent in due season. In 1892, the event against which the whole policy of Bismarck had been directed came to pass. The dual alliance was signed between Russia and France. Although the efforts were not immediately visible, the European situation was in fact transformed. Henceforward, for the undisputed but soberly exercised predominance of Germany, there was substituted a balance of power, two vast combinations, each disposing of enormous military resources, dwelt together, at first side by side, but gradually face to face. I'll stop there for now. So it's a first recording of the elder statesman, Churchill, which is designed either to be of interest or to help you fall asleep and maybe relax a bit. Hope you enjoy